Debbie was already kind enough to do our intro before the transition. Is she in here? No. So I'm just gonna cover it again. Just put a finer note on it. So now that we have Abby, she's a former professor of Spanish and linguistics and current. Oh, let me make sure that we're recording. Yes, great. And current UX researcher with a deep expertise in how language and society intersect. She's led UX research and content strategy across multiple industries, working with Google, Calendly, Princeton, Medtronic, and Best Buy, among others. Recently, as UXR lead for Android's expression team, she worked on Gen AI projects that help Android users express themselves via their cell phones and messaging services. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Abby. All right, everybody can hear me? Sounds like I'm, yep, great, awesome, thank you. Good morning, thank you for coming. We'll just get into it because I got a lot of stuff to cover. So, maybe. There we go. So a little bit of an agenda of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to give you a little bit more background on me. So why am I the person that should be talking to you about this? Then we'll go into the really high level. How do the language and society work? And this is going to be really, really high level. So if you've ever taken a linguistics course, you know that sociolinguistics is something you can study for the rest of your life. I have a whole PhD in it, which means like 6 or 7 years worth of studying. So this is a really high level. Feel free to ask questions at the end if there's anything you want to know more about. I'm sure I also have resources for you if you like academic journal articles, because who doesn't? Then we'll transition to text-mediated or tech-mediated communication. So what is language when we're IRL, face-to-face, that sort of thing? And then how does technology-mediated communication differ if it does at all? And then finally, we'll talk about where does generative AI fit in? That is the new hotness. Everyone wants to put Gen AI in everything. So we're going to talk about what might be a use case for that and what probably isn't a use case for that. Okay, so a little bit about me. I have a PhD in Hispanic and Lusophone literatures, cultures, and linguistics, which is a really long way of saying I'm a sociolinguist. And I understand how language and society intersect and interplay in a very deep way. And as Carissa mentioned, I teach technology and use it in user research, content design, and interaction design. And I was able to bring my background in sociolinguistics and user research, most recently, to my role on the expression team at Android. And what expression was, it was an internal consultancy within Android. And we also partnered with teams across Google, so Chrome, search, photos, things like that. We are focused on helping teams implement, or not, expressive content like emojis, stickers, photos, wallpapers, stuff like that. I was one of the first user researchers to dive into Gen AI in the fall of 2022. What is time? And so I kind of became the go-to on Gen AI for the Android organization for user research. And I also co-authored a white paper on LLMs and use cases for the G4 team on Android. So, dive into language and society. So before we get into the whole communication aspect, I want to give you a couple of definitions here, right? So language is basically anything that can convey meaning to another person. It could be spoken language, it could be written language, it could be sign languages, it could be emoji, it could be stickers, memes, or anything that has meaning and communicative intent, right? So this is kind of a loose definition of what language is. Linguists argue about how to define it all the time. You'll find if you take 10 different textbooks, you have 10 different definitions of what language is, but this is what I'm using for our purposes today. And communication, on the other hand, is the act of conveying or information to someone else. So language is the basis or the tool or the instrument, and communication is the action. So for it to be successful, there needs to be mutual understanding between the people involved. And it can happen when we are face-to-face, via technology, like our phones, SMS or text, social media, DMs, email, comments on a shared document, or good old-fashioned paper, right? Or I suppose perhaps carrier pigeons too. And so language is something that is alive, essentially. It's not some static thing that never changes. And every part of language changes based on context. And so when you talk about linguistic context, and that would be phonetics and phonology. So traditionally we think of sounds, but you can also think of signs too, because signs are signed differently depending on the context as well. And so you articulate your hands for signs in your face and your body, depending on your context too. Syntax and morphology, so that could be like word order, verbs, things like that. Lexicon is our vocabulary. You see a lot of variation in that too. Semantics for meaning, and pragmatics, or what language does. So to give you some examples, if we think of the word orange in Minnesota, we say like orange. But if you go to Long Island, New York, you might hear orange, right? So there's a little bit of change in how people produce those sounds, still mutually intelligible. For syntax and morphology, so we talked a little bit, I mentioned verbs. So if you've ever studied Spanish in high school or college, you know that there is tu, which is a singular intimate version that you use with your friends or your family, something like that. But in Argentina, they also have another one called vos. And so they have the verb morphology endings for vos tenés instead of tu tienes. So that's a difference of a type of variation for morphology. For semantics, different words or phrases can have slightly different meanings. So for example, if you are an older person and you hear a young person say that slaps, and you've never heard that before, you might be like, excuse me, like what? So it has a slightly different meaning depending on who you are, right? Although slaps is kind of going out of style because too many old people are using it now. Pragmatics, as I mentioned, it's what we do with language, and it's really broad. So it can be things like humor, it can be politeness, it can be things like that, right? So for example, what counts as polite in one community versus another. So for example, in the UK, you might hear someone say, "What is your name, please?" So there's this excessive use of the word please that to an American ear might sound overly polite or kind of weird, right? Versus, if we contrast that, if we go to the UK as Americans and say, "What's your name?" and we don't have to please, we might come off as a little bit rude. All right, and so the things that condition the variation we see in language are social factors like age, gender, region. So Minnesota versus Wisconsin, UK versus Australia, things like that. Could be gender, could be race, could be anything that could be used as a community inclusion or exclusion criteria, right? We can also bucket social contexts like work versus home versus school versus the courtroom, et cetera, into factors that condition language use. So we're gonna go a little bit more into detail on what that actually looks like in practice. Okay, so communication and innovation. I mentioned that communication or that language is a living thing and is constantly changing. So what we know is that young people and women are the most innovative with their language use. They're the source of most slang and most language innovations. And many of these language innovations start in Black communities. And then they kind of spread out from there. We kind of co-opt them, right? So there's all of these innovations. They're not predictable. So if you remember the movie Mean Girls, trying to make fetch happen, it's all organic. Like you can't force it. You don't know what's going to take off and what's not going to take off. And sometimes these changes get taken up long-term into the grammar or the system, but sometimes they don't. There's really no way to tell which ones are going to do that and which ones aren't. This is a historical documentation process where you go back and you look at the first usage of a specific term or word or phrase, and then you trace it across time to see how it's changed and how it's been taken up into the grammar. Sorry, I keep doing this. Okay, so now we're going to move on into register. So you just talked about fads and innovation, but we also need to consider register. Language variation or change typically doesn't happen in every register, so your really formal registers are going to be more stuck. They're not going to have a lot of innovation because that's the nature of a formal type of language. So we're talking about the difference. And so I kind of touched on this, but register is how formal or informal the context is. So you can think about your doctor's office versus when you're at home with your family, or at school versus hanging out with a friend at a restaurant, right? There's other factors that go into what register we use. We're going to get into that in a minute, but for now, we're going to focus on the formality of the context. And you can also, if you're a content strategist or content designer, you might think of this as another way to talk about voice and tone. So we have this continuum of register from super formal on one end to super informal on the other. We don't always, they're not discrete categories, right? We can kind of switch between them as we're moving through a conversation or the context changes. So if you want to think about the two poles, though, the super formal register would be like academic writing. So what you would do when you're writing a journal article or a research report or something that requires some kind of legitimacy, right? And on the other end, super informal would be the type of language that you use with your intimate partner, your very best friend, maybe your parents, something like that. Okay. So those two contexts are really very different. The way you would write a paper is not at all the same as the way you would talk to your friend. Okay, so now we're going to go into audience design. So I mentioned the individual factors like race and age and gender and community and things like that go into how you change your language. But we also can think about audience design, which is something we're always doing, whether we know it or not. And when we talk about audience design, we're talking about how we change our language use based off who might hear us, either directly or indirectly. So the known audience, the person that we know is going to be listening to us, is our conversation partner or partners. The unknown or potential audience is anyone who could potentially eavesdrop or overhear on your conversation. So for example, let's say you're chatting with your work bestie in the office, you have an open office plan, and there's potential that your boss or your boss's boss or your great boss or whatever could overhear something that you're saying to this person, right? So there's a risk of overhearing and having someone judge you for the type of things that you're saying at work. So you might change your language to be more work appropriate, right? You might change the things that you say to maybe be less personal. Maybe you don't drop any F-bombs or, whatever the case may be. Now, change that scene to you and your work friend at a restaurant. And let's say there's absolutely zero chance that anyone from work will overhear what you are talking about. Your relationship and the type of things that you say to each other might change, right? So if you're actually really close, you might drop the F-bombs. You might talk about personal things like your family or your, something going on outside of work, right? So the context and who might overhear is going to be really important in conditioning what kind of language we're using. All right, and so another example that you can think about is, let's say you're at a party with your best friend, and it's maybe an intimate affair. There's some strangers there, maybe some mutual friends, and there's not like really loud music or anything. So there's potential for these people that you don't really know very well to overhear your conversation with your friend. And so you might kind of pull back on the types of things you say with them versus how you would chat with them via SMS or text message, right? Or if you were alone together at someone's house without anybody able to overhear you. So that's how actual perceived audience influences our language use. Okay, so what does this look like in real life? We use language to do things like maintain, form, improve, or break relationships. So for example, if you use language that's too informal with someone when your relationship is not that close at the time, it can be really off-putting, right, for you. So think like if you're speaking Spanish and you use tú with a stranger, in some Spanish-speaking countries, that's okay. In other Spanish-speaking countries, that's not okay. You're expressing a level of informality with that person that they're not comfortable with, right? Because that's not the norm. So if they're feeling really generous, they might gently correct you. If they're not, they may cheer you up, depending on the person, right? And it's kind of similar with using appropriate politeness forms. If you're overly polite, you come off kind of weird, right? If you aren't at all polite, you'll be seen as rude. So we have this kind of continuum. And then on the very extreme end is ghosting, right? Where you just withhold all communication whatsoever. So you're like just really obviously breaking that relationship. We also use language to express our identity and who we are as people. You can see this most clearly with code switching, which is the switching between distinct languages, so English, Spanish, English, Swedish, whatever the heck you speak, right? Or you can see it with register switches or variety switches. And what I mean by variety is, so we have, in the United States, we have Standard American English, we have Southern English, we have Black English or African American English, we have Chicano English, we have all kinds of Englishes here in the United States. And legitimately in every other industry country. And so if you're switching between those varieties, that can be considered code switching as well. So when we do that, when we're changing our variety or our language, we are indicating group membership. And so we could be indicating our own group membership with other people and creating solidarity and community. Or we could be excluding an over here. For example, has anyone here had an experience where you heard people speaking in your language, you walk into the room, and then they switch into another language, or if you walk past them? So yeah, so basically what that is you are not part of this. Whether they intended that or not, that's what that's doing. They're excluding you. They're saying you are not in our group right here. And sometimes they do it on purpose. Sometimes that's not intentional. But the point is, they don't want you to be a part of the conversation. Now, on the other hand, we had, in the early 2000s, the media got really pissed off and weird about Barack Obama using Black English with a Black audience. And he wasn't necessarily trying to exclude anybody from that conversation. He was trying to create a relationship with that audience and show group membership, right? But the media got really upset and like, oh, he's racist, whatever. But that's basically how that works, right? So we can use language to express our identities. We can use language to exclude. We can use language to include. Okay, so we also even do this with like different word use. So we can use language to identify membership of groups. So like, as soon as you hear someone say bubbler, you're like, you're from Wisconsin, right? Or if we hear someone say duck, duck, gray duck, you're from Minnesota. All right, so need a drink. So we're going to talk about tech-mediated communication now. Oops. So how is tech-mediated communication different from the IRL interactions that we have? It's not really. It's pretty much the same as face-to-face or paper-written communication. It just has a type of technology that's mediating this communication, right? So, and we have a continuum of styles with technology. And these are just examples. There's a lot of different things that I left out here, but this is just an example to give you an idea of what that kind of looks like. So on the very formal end, we typically have email. Obviously, you could be really informal in email too, but a lot of folks, when we think of email, we're starting to think of work and not necessarily how we communicate with our friends, because you have text messages for that, right? And then you have maybe work, collaborative docs, Google Docs, Confluence. We're chatting with your coworkers and trying to come to an agreement about a specific thing. And then we have social media, we have SMS or text messages. And I mean, I just put these in this order. They could be flip-flopped, but there is a continuum of formality. And there's a lot of other factors that go into determining the formality of a particular medium. But I'm just talking about like basically how we kind of bucket these things right now. All right, now along with that, because we have those different levels of formality for the different kinds of apps or different kinds of technology that we're using to communicate, people are bucketing their relationships in these different apps based on the level of formality. So, and this is really interesting to me. So I'm gonna be talking mostly about Gen Z for the rest of the time because that is the group that I'm most familiar with. But a lot of this variation will happen. You know, Gen X has variation when they do the sort of thing. Gen Alpha, Boomers, all these sorts of people, these different generations are going to use these things in slightly different ways. But I'm talking about Gen Z kind of broadly here. So what they're doing is they're basically bucketing people in apps depending on the intimacy and type of relationship that they have with the person. So the closer you are to that person's inner circle, the more likely you'll be on an app with this person that they perceive to be more intimate, like social media, for example. And sometimes they'll also just see where their friends already are and just go there. Someone started it, and so they're just like, oh yeah, I want to be on the group chat. Or what's your Instagram handle? Or, you know, whatever the case may be. So we'll join them there. And what I found from people is that because we have this like level of formality of the type of app, people are like, oh, I basically only talk to my work friends via email, maybe text message, maybe, but that's kind of crossing a boundary. Relatives are typically in SMS or text, partially because social media is perceived to be more intimate, and so they maybe kind of want to keep relatives that sort of arm's length, like they are, in closer to the inner circle, but they're not like, I don't want to send my most chaotic meme to my grandma because she won't understand it. You can send memes via SMS or text, but it's really easy to do in a lot of social media apps. So they also group friend groups by interest. So I heard some Japanese folks, like, for example, there would be someone would have a knitting group text in Twitter DMs. Oh, sorry, I'm never going to call it X. I swear. So they'll segment these out, right? So like whatever people have access to, whatever they perceive to be the formality level of what they want to do with this person, they're going to segment their friends or their relatives or whoever to that type of technology. So you rarely get people crossing over. And so again, intimate relationships usually happen in apps that allow intimate conversations. And we have this sort of continuum of formality on the type of content that we can send to people. So plain text is kind of considered the most formal, even though we can use it in an informal way. But we have these extra linguistic types of content like emoji or stickers or emoticons or things like that people tend to view as being part of a more informal register. And so if you have access to those things, that kind of makes things a little bit more informal than formal. And so like, for example, if you have someone who is a gamer, they love to use emoji, react stickers, want group chats, they might use WhatsApp, right? Because all those things are available to them. If they want a bunch of custom content and reacts, they might choose Discord, right? Because you can do the group chat, you can do all of that, but now we have custom reacts and we can upload memes and we have like huge libraries of just unhinged stuff to choose from. Okay, so let's talk about variation. So I've been mentioning variation the whole morning, but variation in language use, this happens with tech-mediated communication too. And people change the type of content they send based on a real or perceived relationship with the other person. I kind of touched on that. But to give you an example, I heard from a lot of young people that if there's a power imbalance, so like they're emailing the professor, for example, that person, will never use anything like emoji or emoticons or anything unless the professor or the person with more power uses them first. So they accommodate to what the person with more power is doing first, because that's not appropriate, right? So they take the lead of the other person. And even that, if they use emoticons or emoji, they stick to what I heard called basic emoji. So thumbs up, smiles, thumbs down, no eggplant, nothing like that. A couple of people I talked to said they definitely don't use memes because they are culturally specific and they don't share the same cultural context with like their grandparents, for example. They wouldn't understand them. People felt they might get confused, things like that. And a couple of folks said they have older relatives that use SMS or text messages like emails. So there's a greeting, a body, and a conclusion. So that's how they text their grandparents, for example, which is not how they text their friends. And then one thing that I thought was super funny and interesting is that Japanese youth view emoji use as if you use too many emoji, that's auntie or uncle syntax. And so if you use too many emoji, you look old, and nobody wants that when you're like 18 years old. And a lot of these decisions aren't conscious. Sometimes they are, but when I was talking with people, they would say, oh yeah, I do this. I guess I never realized that I did this, but I do. So how do we design for a communication product or feature? Well, you need to understand your audience first, right? People are chaotic. They will use language however they want to get the message across that they want to convey. You will not stop them. And when I say chaotic, I mean that in a good way, right? And this change, as I mentioned, language is constantly changing. The change is driven by community. It's driven by people. It's not driven by the VP or product, right? So if your product organization tries to create a top-down communication solution, people will try it. If it doesn't work for them, they'll get frustrated and they'll go somewhere else that better meets their communicative needs, right? Or they will Frankenstein a solution with your product or feature if it's the only thing out there. So does anyone remember when Instagram only allowed link in stories for influencers? Yeah, you know what people did? They put it in their bio instead. They would post a story and say link in bio. So they're hacking a way to share the things they wanted to share because platform didn't allow them to do it. So eventually they put link in bio for everybody, or link in story for everybody. So again, you can't create a top-down communication product that will work for everyone. If you do, you risk looking like the hello fellow kids Steve Buscemi meme. Trust me, I use this meme all the time with the executives at Google. It's my favorite. Okay, so how does Gen AI fit into this whole big picture? So you need to ask yourself a bunch of questions before you start implementing Gen AI in any kind of communication product. So do you understand how people are currently using it? Do you understand people's motivations? Do you know what kind of language people are sending through your product? Are they doing just plain text? Do they want to do emoji? Do they want to do stickers? Do they want to do memes? Do they want, like, what do they want? What are they using? What are they trying to use? Do you know what function plain text has versus all this other extra linguistic stuff? And do you know the relative formality of their product and in what context it's used? So one of the things I had to rein in was, Google Chrome wanted to put a commenting feature on something they were developing. They're like, do it. I'm like, why? Why emoji? I don't know. We just think people would want it. Maybe. Did you talk to anybody? So if you answer no to any of these questions, you need to do some research. So, for example, do you know why most people are sending photos via text messaging or other like DM type of things? It's typically to communicate something like, is this the right dog food with a picture of the bag from the grocery store, right? Or look at how far my knitting project has come with a picture of the project. Or look at this weird thing I saw when I was out on my walk, like some kind of ephemera that someone wanted to share. So there's no reason to take any of these products or any of these photos and transform them with generative AI. Like, why would you do that? Your dog food bag doesn't need to look like an anime character. You want to make sure that the person knows that they're getting the right product, right? If you're showing your knitting project, you don't necessarily want to transform that into something weird. You want people to see the colors and the patterns of, the actual progress. So maybe you would just light editing, like checking the contrast or circling something you want people to pay attention to, but generative AI isn't going to provide much value, if any, for this. So you might be wondering, what about LLMs? Okay, well, again, people are chaotic and they like it. They break grammar rules on purpose for specific communicative reasons, like, oh, really? So we do this for a variety of reasons, but people do it on purpose. And so if you get some kind of LLM rewriting what you're trying to convey in a more formal tone, you just basically lose all the essence of yourself, your personality, the humor or the sarcasm, whatever the case may be. It turns into something really bland. So that can be really irritating. We already deal with autocorrect. That is a big enough pain in our butts. We don't really need an LLM to make it worse, right? But it can be helpful in specific contexts. So something more formal where you don't necessarily want or need to have a ton of your personality to come through in your message. So it can work. If you need to write a quick email to someone and shoot it off, fine. It can also be appropriate for language learners. So folks who are feeling some insecurity and they don't really feel like they, will be taken seriously. I don't agree with this use case because for reasons, I was a language teacher for a long time. So we can talk about that later, but it is definitely a use case that some folks would find helpful, right? So, and also I want to point out, LLMs are by definition historical text. They cannot keep up with the speed and rate of language change that people are producing. It's always going to be lagging behind. So if you're trying to get something that is innovative, that's fun, that's young, it's not going to work. It's going to come off as inauthentic. At best, at worst, you would come off as like racist or abusive, right? So just keep that in mind. But LLMs are historical text producers. So the other thing I want to bring up is people have concerns about generative AI. They have really strong feelings. In my experience, the attitudes range from, I would never touch that with a 10-foot pole. You can't make me, to, you feel weird about it, but it's kind of cool, to, yeah, I love this, it's great. And you need to respect all of these people on the continuum, right? They're concerned about their own or others' intellectual property being stolen without their consent. They want to know that their personally identifiable information isn't going to be fed into a model without their consent. They want to be assured that they won't be served harmful, violent, or abusive images or language, and they want to know that they're going to be respected. So this leads us to that this needs to be an opt-in experience, right? We need to get consent before having people use Gen AI tools, especially if the data they entered will be used to train a model. They want to be able to choose not to use it if they're one of those who are vehemently opposed to the technology for whatever reason. And they want to be informed before using it. They want informed consent. It should be very clearly a feature, a Gen AI feature or product. It should be labeled. They should be able to look at it and say, this is Gen AI. I can use this, or I can choose not to. I want to. This also means that if you are a user researcher, if you don't have some sort of informed consent in your screener or your consent form that you will be using their data to create summaries or insights, you need to put it in there right now. People want agency. They want to know how their data is going to be used. They want to know whether they're going to be participating in something they may have a moral objection to. So you need to include that if you are a user researcher. And finally, people want to feel confident that there are guardrails. So I was the lead researcher on the Generative AI wallpaper tool that was released with Android 14. What I heard over and over again is, what if I give my 10-year-old a pixel? Are they going to be served something that's really harmful? Or is there going to be a guardrail to make sure that they're not? They want to know that they're going to be respected enough to be kept from these abusive, harmful, violent images. So you might be thinking, okay, so is it even good for anything in any context? Actually, yeah, what it's good for stuff like memes and custom stickers and things like that, because what it can do is create the content that you want. You can take the text that you want to overlay and put into a sticker or a meme or whatever, and you can send it quickly and easily. Right now, people are taking a lot of time out of their days to create custom memes and stickers and things like that to upload to Discord or, whatever. And so having a tool right there that allows them to quickly and easily make these chaotic things that they want to send to their friends to make them laugh, that's actually a value add for people. However, a lot of the models are not there yet. When I was working on these projects, they were definitely not there. Things were not spelled correctly and things looked really weird. But in the future, this is actually a really good use case for people in a communicative context because people are really creative and expressive. And Gen AI can provide the flexibility for this to be a really big value because language is constantly changing, evolving, and people are creating things and innovating and stuff. And so this is actually where it could be really valuable because it is flexible once the models get there. So we'll wrap up. Things I want you to take away from today is that language is a living thing. It's constantly changing, and those changes may or may not be permanent, and we need to be aware of that. And communication norms are community-driven. You need research to identify user needs, whether you have any at all or not. And people group their relationships by app based on closeness and communicative needs. And Gen AI's best use case is to create custom stickers and memes because it provides the flexibility to adapt to these changes quickly. And you must make your Gen AI experiences opt-in. You need to get consent and you need to provide guardrails. One of the biggest mistakes I saw was executives saying, let's put Gen AI in everything. And they didn't want to take the time to understand whether there was an actual use case and what the concerns were. So that was my job, was to go talk to them and be like, hey, actually, no, don't do that. All right, so that's all I have.